The law's murky because I've had subtenants call me, oh, I didn't know I was illegal.
Welcome to the BTS Presents show.
I'm Brian Shulman, I'm the producer. We're currently doing segments on Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate behind the scenes. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Candace Bradfield, broker and owner of Bradfield & Associates, and past president of our Santa Cruz County Association of Realtors. I want to thank you for joining BTS Presents.
Hi, welcome to BTS Presents. I'm Brian Shulman, tonight's host. Today we're doing Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate behind the scenes episodes, and we have today with our show Cynthia Berger and Robert Norse. So who'd like to go first, and what thoughts do you have about housing in Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley?
Let the rent control person do it.
Okay, great. Okay.
Well, my name's Cynthia Berger, and I'm a tenant organizer and a tenant activist and a tenant advocate and a tenant counselor. So I'm not a housing advocate, I'm a tenant advocate. It's a little different. And my group is called Santa Cruz Tenants Association. I founded it 4 years ago and I have the only bilingual hotline for tenants to call and find out what their rights are in the county. And I also have a website, which is santacruztenants.weebly.com. And my number is 831-222-0359. That's the hotline number.
I see you brought a whole lot of notes and things you wanted to say, and I know that you're very busy with what's going on with Measure M. So please go ahead and say
great.
whatever you need to say.
I wanted to address some talking points that are not accurate that have been going around and clear them up. One of them is that once the ballot measure, if it were to pass, it could not be passed unless there were a 2/3 vote. Well, 2/3 vote standard applies to tax laws. It doesn't apply to this kind of law. So 50% plus one voter gets it changed if they would so desire, if it gets passed. So I just want to clear that up.
I heard earlier this week that there was a discussion about whether to repeal it after it was passed, it would require a 2/3 vote, and that was quite a different scenario than they originally discussed.
They're making a lot of stuff up that are lies, and so the fact of the matter is, if you don't repeal it, you make a new charter amendment. If it's passed by a 50+1 standard, then if you want to change that charter amendment, then you need a 50+1 standard.
So
it's
originally
not about repealing, it's about changing the charter.
But originally they said, like a couple of months ago, that it was going to require 2/3 to change it. The city or the proponents against it, or it depends?
The city attorney has sent out a letter, which I had seen, answering that question, and he said 50% plus one.
Correct. That's the new information that I heard earlier this week.
So that's the correct information. So we can really put the other, whatever people were saying months ago that was incorrect, to bed, because it's being constantly dredged up. And it's convincing people every day, and it's just a lie.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I've asked you to be here, is to try to get accuracy in the markarbase about what the facts are.
Yeah. So another issue that's come up a lot is subleasing. So there's some limits on subleasing that are new in our ballot measure. They limit the landlord's ability to evict for good cause when 3 conditions are met. And this is in section 5A2, capital A, of the ballot measure.
Measure M, correct?
Measure M, correct. So there are 2 different situations that can occur. A roommate can replace a departed tenant, or a tenant could sublet their entire apartment or home. In the case of roommates replacing other roommates, an original tenant, these 3 conditions have to be met, and the landlord will have an ability to evict for good cause. it will limit their ability to evict for good cause if these conditions are met, excuse me. So if it's an original tenant who's on the lease contract and they continue to reside in the unit as their primary residence. That's condition 1. Condition 2, the sublease replaces one or more departed tenants on a one-to-one basis. That's condition 2. The condition 3, the landlord unreasonably withheld the tenant's request to sublease, including occupancy levels.
When you say unreasonably, what do you mean by
Well,
that?
reasonable and unreasonable are legal terms.
I see.
They're defined by the judge or they're defined by whoever. Those are just legal terms and they're used all the time in tenant law. For example, a landlord has to fix something within a reasonable amount of time. They don't
Whatever that
specify the exact period.
So one of the things that I've heard regarding this discussion subject is that a person who is leasing a space can bring in numerous family members and visitors and allow them to take upon residency in the property, and then they can leave, and then all those other people can be grandfathered into the property lease. Can you speak to that if there's anything that you'd like to say about that?
So the law in Santa Cruz is much more restrictive than the law in San Francisco as to what family members may be brought in on your lease. And there are occupancy levels that I think people have to comply with. And so yes, they may bring in certain family members, and so then they're not on the street homeless. That's good for the city. And
Okay, I just wanted to let you know
the second part
that
of your question was,
well, understanding that
issue
one of
was-
the things that I've heard, which may or may not be accurate, is, say, for example, a space
Oh,
that
yes,
has
right.
500 square feet can have 50 people living in it.
well, that's just ridiculous. And so that's where reasonable applies. A reasonable standard under the law applies. These things are not prescribed by how many people per square foot. You know, some people would like to interpret what they read in the fair housing laws in that way, but that's not how it goes when you go to a judge or a rent board. It's about reasonable, and it also it involves the age of the house and the condition of the house and the fragility of the house. There's a lot of things that can come into play.
Okay.
So another thing is that if you have someone that you brought in on a sublease and the person whose primary residence it is, the tenant on the lease, they move out, that subletter, they have a right to stay there until the end of the lease. That's it.
Correct.
After that, they can be evicted.
I see.
Yeah, and that's pretty much how it is sometimes currently. The law's murky. This makes the law really firm. The law's murky because I've had subtenants call me, oh, I didn't know I was illegal, and
Because
they
the
get
lease
some
ended and they
extra
were still
time.
living in there.
Yeah, they are often given extra time.
And
so in
one
this
more
case,
one more thing before we go on to Robert Norse for a moment, but what about when a person is staying past the end of the lease and a landlord wants to evict them? I understand there's some just cause evictions along with the tenant rights that are being considered that go along with these ordinances of Measure M.
if a landlord, the end of a lease is not a just cause for eviction. So is that what you're asking? No, it's absolutely not just cause for eviction, because we have laws in this state that say, oh, let's see, when you kick somebody out, you can kick somebody out whenever you want, and when you kick them out, you can raise the rent to the sky. We're changing that. The tenants are changing that, city by city. That's just not going to happen when you've got so many homeless people, you've got extremely high rents, and you've got to keep people housed.
So
So
does
they
the-
have to not just be evicted whenever the landlord feels like it. Yes,
Well, at the end of a
landlords
lease,
don't like that.
But the end of a lease is the end of a contract, so wouldn't that be the terms of an agreement, that the agreement is ended and the terms end and therefore the tenancy ends?
This has been through the courts in California many times. It's been litigated. It's all settled law.
Cynthia, I've got a
You can put a
We'll be right there, Robert.
just cause the end of a lease. It's not a just cause to evict someone.
Okay.
The landlord no longer is going to have full, rights to kick people out as they do now. Yes, it's true.
Okay, we'll come back to that in just a second.
The
Robert, go
question I
ahead.
have is regarding this.
And by the way, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about HUFF, the organization you're
Sure, I
representing?
can, but I've got a question
Of
that
course,
she has
of course.
about what you were saying a moment ago, which is the landlord required to create a new lease at the end of the landlord can change the lease once the leasing period is ended, isn't that correct?
The landlord can change the material terms of the lease. They just, if they're covered by rent control, they will not be able to raise the rent higher than whatever the limit is. And
Is it
when you
3%
raise
a year?
It's
Or is it
it's
cost of
it's
the
it's
CPI?
yeah,
Yeah.
the CPI.
Consumer
Consumer price index
pricing
of the San Francisco Bay Area,
Right.
that particular.
So
consumer
whatever
price
that goes
index.
up is the amount that the rent can go up.
Yeah, if you're covered by rent control. At the
Correct.
moment, at this moment, there are buildings that can and can't be covered by rent
Is that because of
control.
Costa Hawkins or some of the
Yes.
terms? All right,
Yes,
we'll talk a
because of
little bit
Costa
about that in a minute, but
Yeah.
let's go back to Robert so he can
Right.
do a nice
Well, it's-
introduction.
I will in the moment.
Okay, back
Again,
to
I'm
you
trying,
again.
still trying to
Yeah.
nail down this point, which is your concern, I think, Brian. That
Not
at
my
least-
concern, just
no,
something I
the
mentioned.
one that the concern of some that
Okay.
you presented
Correct.
Yeah.
was, well, you're stuck with, it goes on indefinitely, you can't get out of the lease. But in fact, the landlord can change the lease if she or he wants.
You can change
After the end of the lease or
At the
during
end
the
of the
terms
lease.
of the lease?
At
No.
the end of the lease.
At the end
You
of the
can
lease.
change a lease during as well, but the tenant has to sign off to it because it's a contract.
Right.
So you have to give a tenant 30 days notice if you want to change lease terms.
Right.
If you want to
Which is
change
contract law.
Yeah, and if you want to change lease terms at the end of the lease, the same thing applies.
Correct. You give them 30 days,
Yeah,
they
and
consider
you-
the terms, and if they
Yeah.
do or they don't,
And
then
you
they...
absolutely can, and if they don't sign it, then that is a just cause for eviction, is it not?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's a just cause for eviction. It might be an agreement
It's in
to...
the law.
I was thinking that it might be an agreement to terminate a lease.
It's in the law. If you do not sign a lease, then you may be evicted.
Correct,
It's in
because it's
yeah.
contract law, which is not something that we are
Right.
choosing to agree to. It's the terms of legal precedent.
Right, so both people have to agree.
Okay.
So if the tenant doesn't agree, I do believe they may be evicted at that point because the contract has lapsed.
Well, we can bring a
Yeah.
lawyer to the discussion and get more
I already
accuracy.
checked it out with the
And we
lawyer.
have too. We've had Ed Fry come and be on the show as well, and he's talked a little bit about these things.
Yeah, well, I work with rent control specialists.
I'm sure you do,
that-
and we
they
appreciate
just-
all the work that you're doing. But please, Robert, can you do a little introduction of yourself so we can make
Certainly.
sure to
Why
get
not?
that?
I like to do that.
Okay, great.
I'm Robert Norse, and I work with a group called Homeless United for Friendship and Freedom, which tenants are likely to become homeless in the current situation. Even homeowners can become homeless and have.
Great.
Housing for for homeless people is a tent or a shelter or a car often. And so in a way, we're trying to stick with the topic of the show, which has to do with housing for really very poor people. Which,
No, housing for all people.
yeah, but in this case, I'm talking about a particular segment of the community.
Correct.
And because that's a subject I'm more familiar with. I can't really speak a lot to what Cynthia has been talking about or what your absentee landlord figure who may or may not show up during this broadcast.
Let's describe other people as other experts and
As those
other real
other-
estate professionals.
Right, or those on the other side of this dispute.
Not other side, just
Well, there are two sides to this measure.
no.
of dispute.
As I've been told by one of the people on city council who rides a bicycle, that there are many different sides of a discussion, not just two.
In this case, you vote yes or no on the measure. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, yes. In this situation, I'm concerned, as I talked to you about earlier, with what happened at the city council. Here's a,
Here, why don't Lim
this
pass
is
it over.
this is a presentation that the city council
Thank you.
made available at its last meeting. What they did was they claimed to have expanded what's called winter shelter. Every winter, the weather gets colder, and they've had, last winter, about 110 people had options to get into shelter out of a population of, I don't know, 1,000 to 2,000 homeless people. So it's only a fraction. But this winter, this is no longer possible. And at the same time, the city council is claiming it has expanded winter shelter. And this is something that is, I think, really misleading. In fact, I would even say a deliberate hoax.
Well, let's take a look at what this says actually.
Sure.
Expand the River Street camp by 20 tent sites to
Correct.
accommodate up to 75 to 80 individuals who are in large part sleeping outside. Expand the HSC Paul Lee Loft by 20 shelter beds to accommodate up to 60 individuals. Expand access to hygiene services. Expand and diversify shelter capacity by supporting a safe parking program to include 50 parking spaces. So, you want to pass that back? What is it about that you find
Well, this is
not
not
misleading?
all these three programs that you mentioned.
Well, I didn't mention it. I just read what the...
Right, well, that's what you were referring to.
Okay.
There's the Paul Lee Loft, which you can't get into on a walk-in basis. There's a waiting list. It's not like a winter shelter where you can knock on the door and say, I'm cold, sign me up for the night, I want to go in there. That's not the Paul Lee Loft, unless they're going to change the standards, and they haven't indicated that they will.
Well, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is the removal of the winter shelter is one thing, and the expansion of 3 other aspects is another. But you're saying that you think that the removal of the winter shelter is unacceptable, or
No, there is no winter shelter in the sense that you can walk in and get winter shelter,
Okay.
as has been the case for 25 years. Or since
And where was
1980.
that winter shelter, and who managed it, and who
Well,
provided it?
last year it was the Association of Faith Communities that managed it at the Salvation Army and at the Veterans Hall at the edge of town.
Correct.
A couple years ago it was the Armory. It was managed by the homeless, what I call the homeless lack of
And
services
how many people
center.
do you think were using that on a daily basis as an average?
Well, they averaged about, I think, somewhere between 50 and 100.
Okay, so let's say there's 50 to 100 people that were using that on an average, and those.
None of them can use these services.
Right, but are there 50 or 100 spaces for people now somewhere else during the winter?
No.
Well, what about what Brent Adams has provided for?
He hasn't provided, he has a warming center,
warming
which is
center.
open, last winter was open, I think, less than 10 nights
But
out
it
of the
is-
entire winter.
Well, but it's open when the temperature reaches a level that requires winter assistance, if I understand the terms.
To who?
Disabled people,
whom?
elderly.
I don't know. I don't use it, so I don't know
disabled
the
and
terms of
elderly people need assistance every night. They don't need it on, when the temperature drops. They particularly need it when the temperature drops below 30.
Okay.
But the fact of the matter is, to claim that that's some sort of solution to the situation, or that they're getting it when they need it, simply isn't true.
I hope you don't think I said that.
I thought I heard you say it, but
No, what
I'm
I said
I'm glad
was
to be corrected.
it has terms that the winter warming center is open during
The
certain.
warming center is not a city-funded program.
Correct.
It is a place that some private individuals have put together for a very few number of nights.
Okay.
The city has refused to support it, whereas the winter shelter program has been a nightly activity.
Okay, so what do you think the reason for removing the winter shelter is, according to what you heard being mentioned? Because I haven't looked into the details.
Well, it's a real interesting question. I don't have the answer to that question. This was just dropped upon us at the last Tuesday City Council
Was
meeting.
there anything else about HUFF or yourself or your organization that you're representing you'd like to say before we go back to Cynthia?
My concern is that the people realize that there is no walk-in winter shelter this winter, and therefore what they're doing is they're getting $30 million, and they're not expanding or even restoring the winter shelter that they had last winter. Instead, they're expanding these programs, which actually are fund magnets for the federal funding, because you need a pathway to housing to get into them.
So let me ask you one more question before we go back to Cynthia. If you think about this from a larger perspective than just Santa Cruz City, and we look at it from a Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley and San Francisco, the marketplace, and all the way down to Carmel and Big Sur, are you noticing a trend or a discussion that's in the larger perspective that's not just about Santa Cruz City and these 3 small programs, which are important?
Well, I've
but
not
small?
heard that they've eliminated winter shelter, which has always been a token effort. I got to make that really clear. In other words, it's not a big deal for the majority of people outside. The real issue for people outside is, will they be arrested for putting up their own tents and their own shelter in Santa Cruz? Will their tents be taken away? Will their property be seized by Parks and Rec and Santa Cruz police officers? These are the issues for homeless people. But in answer to your question, I'm not aware that any other jurisdiction has cut back winter shelter in this way.
Okay.
It's peculiar, and I don't quite understand.
Okay, well,
the
let's get some
rationale.
more information. We could talk about it either offline or we could talk about it a
Sure.
little bit further later. If you don't mind, let's go
Not
back
at
to
all.
Cynthia. Please, let's continue with some of the things you wanted to talk about.
Okay, thank
Measure-
you. I
measure M's.
appreciate the time. So another issue that's come up is a lot of concern about the rent board, and one concern in particular.
The cost of the rent board, $300,000 to pay for a rent board to manage the rent control?
Every city has a rent board, and very few of them are in debt. So I think that the rent board can set their own budget and run it well. I don't have any concerns about that because I've studied the other cities, and the ones that started recently, they've paid back the monies that they used for starting up their however many hundreds, thousands, or millions it is. Santa Cruz is a small city. It should be costing less because there will be fewer units to deal with and fewer landlords to deal with, very fewer landlords at the rate the market's going right now, as it's all concentrating. So anyway, one concern that came up was that any base rent in a new construction would be set by the rent board and would be arbitrary. And so I want to address
So that's what
that
was
issue.
said, and you want to try to clarify that.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so unfair limitations by the rent board to new rents would precipitate fair returns petitions because landlords have a right under the measure to maintenance of net operating income to maintain their net
let's
operating
talk about what
income.
net operating income is. And I'm a mortgage banker, and you can find my mortgage information at 123loans.bts.com. We could talk a little bit about financing available, but I can just let you know that when you think about net operating income, one of the things that I've heard being discussed is, let's say somebody has received a property and there's no mortgage on it, and it's been grandfathered into their estate from years ago when their grandfather bought a property. Now they have no mortgage on it and they have no expenses on it other than taxes and upkeep and maintenance. The net operating cost for that property would be lower than somebody else who buys a brand new $1.5 to $2 million house on Cliff Drive and then wants to rent it, and they have a huge mortgage of a jumbo loan over $1 million, $1.5 million. Could somebody get the door, please? $1.5 million, and then that person has a high expense and their net operating cost is a lot higher. Is the rent board going to consider that those two properties don't necessarily have the same expense, the same income?
So unfair limitations by a rent board, as I was saying, would precipitate fair returns petitions by the landlords, either landlord. If it was unfair, they would petition the rent board. Such petitions would be predicted by the rent board. There would be no base year to set the maintenance of net operating income for a new construction.
Can you explain that other than in the terms of that?
It's a new building. You can't maintain a rent that was never changed before. So it's a new building, it hasn't been rented before. So it doesn't have a record of what it needs to maintain its net operating income. So of course, someone has to set the initial rent. And it
you're
has
saying
to be
the rent board would do that?
They have the option to do that, yes.
And then the tenant or the landlord would then have the option to petition that if it doesn't seem reasonable or fair.
Absolutely. And the rent board would take into consideration, as would the landlord, in section A11, little a 3. It would be practically and legally difficult for the rent board to take such action. What would be the maintenance standard? If a landlord petitions the city and they pay all those legal costs for a lawyer to do that, on top of all the expensive land and the building, what might happen is that the petitions could result in a higher, in even less affordable rents than they originally planned for being set. So it's a reasonableness standard here.
Correct. We're back to reasonableness again.
So does the rent board want to set even higher rents because they went through the formula and that's what they came out with? No. And does the landlord want to set a higher rent that nobody can afford? No. So that's the answer to that. It's just really not going to happen.
Well, I must say that it's a pleasure to have both of you here. I think we're going to take a break and we'll come right back and we'll see what changes we're going to make to our discussion. Okay? Thank you.
Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Hi, we're here with Keshav Kumar at the Measure M event at Stockwell Cellars.
Heather, we are here today because we are standing against the rent control measure that's going to be on the ballot in November because we think it will be far too costly and far too wasteful to our city. We believe that there are many solutions to finding affordable housing in Santa Cruz, and band-aids like this aren't going to do the trick. We need to make sure that we're working together as a community to create a cohesive solution that actually makes sure that all constituents of the city are served. And so this solution is frustrating to us because it only serves a small minority of people in our city. So I'm standing here as a volunteer and as a canvasser because I do not believe Measure M is the solution.
What do you think about outside of the Santa Cruz County area about the whole issue of rent control nationally or locally?
I think the Stanford study is the only thing I really need to cite here because it proves, and there are many studies like it, that the city of San Francisco did not benefit from rent control. And the entire economics department at my university, University of California, Santa Cruz, is against this measure. So there's quite a bit of academic proof that rent control doesn't work. Outside of Santa Cruz, this would be the most extreme version of rent control. And so I don't see this working out any better than it did in the outside cases that we've seen.
What can you say about the people behind you that are protesting your position? Because clearly they have a different perspective than you.
They're passionate individuals who believe that we need a solution to affordable housing to make sure that people can stay in this area. I respect the passion, but at the same time, I do not believe Band-Aid solutions like Measure M are the solution.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
And a renter here in Santa Cruz. I first became interested in working in politics because of my interest in fairness and human rights, which is something, because I live here in Santa Cruz, California, immediately led me to working on the housing crisis. It is also something that may get you to beg the question of why I'm in here talking to you and not outside. That is because Measure N is not a policy that will help Santa Cruz. It will not help landlords, yes, but it will also not help renters, individuals experiencing homelessness, or do anything to address California's most prevalent issue, the lack of affordable housing.
We've started canvassing early this month. Robert has an excellent team of trained canvassers out there every day. The thing that is fantastic about it is that they are young renters that recognize that this is bad for the future of rental housing in Santa Cruz. So we have young renters canvassing daily. We would like to have additional canvassers. So again, opportunity for everybody to help us out. There'll be a training this weekend at noon at Cruz that Robert. Saturday noon. Our website traffic doubled in August to about 3,500 unique visitors so far. So the website is doing extremely well. And I want to encourage everybody to realize that part of the way that we're organizing and mobilizing is from the website. So if you have people interested, send them to the website, have them read about it, have them join our email list, and then also on the website you can people other than you guys who are now know what's going on. They can get a yard sign, they can endorse off the website. So
Thanks for watching the BTS Presents show.